So the world's experiencing some tremendous economic divergences these days. Some of them were brought about by global conflict, some by domestic strife, some due to the changing terms of global trade, but many were born out of bad policy decisions. And now we're left as investors trying to figure out where to put money to work as we head into 2025. We've had some pretty incredible moves, both positive and negatives, in economic activity this year, as well as in market moves. And we'll try and make sense of some of that today. So trade uncertainty has been going on for decades now, and it reflects shifts in the global economy that have been going on for some time. As we head into 25, President-elect Trump will likely add to that uncertainty. Has been both unpredictable and somewhat contradictory in his policies and statements, which makes it a little bit more challenging to figure out how to play the field as we move forward, both for U.S. investors, but also for governments around the world that are trying to figure out what their policies are and how to line against the new U.S. administration. But the changing terms of trade have been going on for a while, mainly coming out of the great financial crisis when we had all the distortions that were going on domestically in different economies. And you started to see more trade interventions, which were negative towards globalization and liberalization. As you can see from the red lines here, harmful trade policies versus liberalizing trade policies were really running at a pretty high rate negatively, and then accelerated from over the last 4 years. So where do we go from here, and what does it mean? I think we're trying to see what the playing field looks like for investors. So let's go around the globe, starting with China. And when you have the two biggest economies diverging the way they are, and this is just looking at yields right now and going through the battles we're going through, the 10-year yields are reflecting the divergences where the U.S. has been holding around the 4 to 4.5 range for some period of time. But now you're seeing China's yields, which have been steadily declining, have now moved down pretty sharply in the last month or two post-election, are now at new record lows, closing in on 170 today. So you're starting to see some of the challenges that exist in the Chinese economy, and also some of the strengths near term in the U.S. economy and how that's played out. The big question around China, there are many, but one of the big ones, aside from how did the U.S. and China really end up playing longer term, is how does China's stimulus work on the economy and what investment opportunities are created out of that? And I think for people expecting the old China playbook, which was to stimulate manufacturing and that would move the global economy forward, is not actually working that way. And it seems to be that the focus is more on stability rather than growth. And the question really is, were they holding back, waiting for the Trump administration? Are they going to unleash policies that will drive domestic demand better? Or are they going to keep dumping oversupply onto the global system? And I think that's one of the challenges for investors, is to sort out, how does China work with their two biggest end markets, North America and Europe? And how does that play out given some of the challenges that exist? I also think capital flows and some of the secular challenges that are facing China are real, but I think that China's system, China's economy, and China's contributions to growth will continue. I think it's just going to require a lot of selectivity, as we'll see in other regions as well. One of the big areas for the last couple of years that gets a lot of attention at events like we had in Florida a couple of years ago is India, and it's been one of the bright spots in the global economy, but it also is starting to see slower growth. And I guess the question with India is, where are they going to play in the global economy? What is their core value that they're adding to the rest of the system that allows them to both import and export talent and opportunity, both goods and services? And I think one of the challenges when you look at what drove China's growth is they were easily the lowest cost manufacturer. Now they're trying to move up the manufacturing curve to more advanced manufacturing, which has created an opportunity, but I don't think it's one that India will play in. I think India has to find where it's going to drive their role in the global system going forward to take advantage of all the benefits that they have. But keep in mind, this is an economy that's grown for some time and it still is experiencing some challenges of having that materialize into better economic outcomes for its population and stronger outcomes for its businesses. Shifting to Europe, I think we're seeing with the ECB cutting inflation and growth forecasts, I think the big issue here isn't the inflation coming down, but the anemic growth that they have against the problems that are facing many of the European nations, and how do they move forward when we look at their two leading economies, France and Germany, both having their governments thrown out. And just looking at Germany, which has been one of the bright spots for Europe for a long time, has been in recent years becoming less of one. And now looking at their growth rates of negative 0.1, negative 0.2, the last 2 years, now moving up to 0.2% this year, 0.8 next year, and 0.9 the year after. Those are terrible growth numbers and don't allow an economy to move forward in a way it needs to. And I think this is a reflection of a lot of bad policy decisions, but also some cyclical issues as well, but longer-term structural issues facing it. And one of the biggest policy mistakes, aside from the over-reliance on Russia for energy, was their years of underinvestment. And just looking at Germany compared to the other G7 nations, and when they were doing a third or less of what the spend, a third less of the spend that the other nations are, it's not a surprise that they're starting to see some of the cracks in their foundation that are coming to roost right now. So if Germany can't get their act together and France can't get their act together, it's going to be very tough for Europe to do it. So the European Commission is trying to figure out the path forward to bring back European competitiveness. But the challenge still exists of how do you bring the different nations together to get the value that they can as one bloc, and how do you do that given the political differences and some of the domestic differences that exist today? I think it's going to be a challenge. So I think Europe has to find new leadership and find stronger leadership with a vision to move the project forward, or else you'll see a further degrading of some of their national champions, and that makes it very hard for them to come out of some of the doldrums that they're in right now, in my opinion. We just heard from Jeff on South Korea, and you can see they have recently cut rates to offset some of their growth issues and some of the messy politics, but if on the ground it's not impacting too much, that's a positive, but it certainly is unsettling. But they need to get growth back on track. And with the tensions that continue to exist in the South China Sea, how does that all play out? Do they attract capital or does it start shifting? I think is one of the fears that a lot of governments are going to have. When we move to the emerging market economies, 54 of the EM countries are spending more than 10% of their revenues on debt servicing. You have two countries, Pakistan and Ethiopia, that have debt servicing cost above 30% of GDP. Very difficult to get out of the challenges, meet the population's demands when so much of your spend is going to servicing your debt. And as the dollar gets stronger, the dollar-denominated debts become more expensive to service against a weak currency. Not a great setup there. So you are seeing some big challenges exist. There are some new opportunities. You're seeing Milei and others doing some interesting things in Latin America. So I'm interested to hear the panel, Mark, in Florida talking about that, because I think where you go and how you discern which countries you're going to play in will have big outcomes in terms of how you play the emerging market economies. Which then brings us back to the U.S., which has been one of the bright spots in the global system and a magnet for capital. And we see that in part because there were some good policy decisions surrounded by a lot of bad ones that we've made. But the industrial policies of bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., the Inflation Reduction Act and others, has created a shift where we're now starting to see capital flows in the U.S. We thought the consumer would get wary, but I think what we're seeing right now is a transition from the government sector to the private sector, where you're starting to see corporations step in and fill the void where government spending was carrying through. And yet we also have a very fractured consumer, but consumer net worth has recently hit a record high of $174 trillion. That's divided in the U.S. of about 25% of that net worth is in housing, 35% is in equities, and 40% is in bank deposits. So when I look at the U.S. economy right now, there are a couple things that stand out. One is this shift from the government to private sector, where corporations are picking up their capex, particularly the big corporations. It's not going to be evenly distributed. You have consumer net worth, where about 80 trillion of the 174 trillion is with the boomers who are no longer working and will be spending. So where you would expect spending to be slowing because of the number of boomers and their consumer net worth, that's giving them not only the firepower, but the time to do more spending. And now that the markets and housing have been rallying up for the high-end consumer, that gives them even more fodder to spend. So that's offsetting some of the challenges we know and some of the inequalities we know. And then when you step back, we're sitting on $7 trillion of money market assets and demand deposit assets, which is about 25% of GDP. And as we see the economy moving forward into next year, any shift of that money into the markets, both public and private, could have a very profound impact on the system. So we're right now waiting to see what Powell does, which is coming up tomorrow. And the betting markets for tomorrow are almost at a 97 or 98% probability of a Fed cut of 25 basis points. But I think we can expect what will be determined, if there is a cut, what you would call a hawkish cut, where they will change the parameters. So the chart I'm showing you is the market's expectation from the CME futures on where they think the Fed funds will be at the June meeting. And I suspect that this chart will shift closer to the right side, where you'll see people shift their rate cuts to maybe 2 cuts for next year. If the Fed goes 25 tomorrow, I think they're going to call for a pause in their rate cuts to see how the economy is working for 2 reasons. One is Powell doesn't, and nobody really knows where the neutral rate is. Neutral rate being where rates are not too restrictive or too stimulative. We don't know where that rate is, and I don't think they're going to find it out between today and tomorrow. And the second is Powell has to factor in, although he's not supposed to, what the impact of future fiscal policy will be on inflation expectations. And with tariffs, the expectation is when tariffs go in, you have a 1-year inflationary impact, and then you get a price reset and you go from there. It's not a permanent inflationary set, although you do have cost of living that stays through with it. So I think these are the big issues that are facing people. But as much as there is U.S. exceptionalism, we do have our own problems. And productivity is going to be the key for everybody. As employment rises around the world, as immigration issues play out, how productive the labor market becomes will determine the success of companies and economies. And you can see the U.S. has been among the most productive developed market economies. I was asked earlier how this compares to China, and I would say that China's numbers have tended to be higher but are coming down. They're around the 4% range, but there are other studies that say that China for the last 20 years has been a fraction below the global average in productivity. So I'm not sure the actual numbers on that. I think we'd have to come back for more discussion there. But all is not right at home. We had another shooting in Wisconsin at a school where a 15-year-old shot and killed a teacher and I think 2 other students. That emergency call to 911 was called in by a 2nd grader. So we still have those problems. The murder rate in the U.S. is 6 times that of the UK, 30 times that of Japan. So one area that we have problems. I mentioned the wealth disparity in the U.S., where half the wealth is controlled by a very small number of boomers. And then you look at the pension crisis. And Illinois is a classic example of a state that has not kept up with their pension obligation funding and are now looking at a state with a population of 12.5 million people, 5.5 million households. And after the tremendous move we've had in the markets over the last several years, they have unfunded liabilities of $211 billion. You can see the funding status of the firefighters, police, and teachers unions, which all are obligations that have to be paid in some way, shape, or form, which leaves each household in the state of Illinois with a bill of an obligation of $41,617. So while we expect capital to continue to flow to the U.S., we believe the problems here are real and persist. So where would you put money to work for next year? Well, the case for staying home is the U.S. continuing to be a magnet for capital and the best house in an imperfect global neighborhood. I think the policies that are being put out is as contradictory and as controversial as the president-elect can be. The policies around deregulation, keeping energy costs down through energy independence, and working on some of the growth initiatives he has are going to be policies that move the country forward and actually add value to corporations. Particularly mid-cap corporations become big beneficiaries of deregulation. Small cap companies, because half of them are in the Russell, are not making money now. Any increased spend is very difficult for them. So much of their money is going to either debt servicing or covering other costs that it's going to be very difficult for them to make the investments. But mid-cap companies and large-cap companies can continue to benefit from the opportunity. I think reserve currency status matters. So does our innovation ability and our ability to adapt. But productivity is the key for all nations. But in the U.S., if we move from our 2+ productivity to 3 to 4%, that'll have a material impact on the opportunities for companies to produce higher earnings. So a big opportunity for the U.S. At the same time, the battle between the U.S. and China are a case for going global and moving away from those two countries, as I think they are defining opportunities for countries like India, some of the LATAM countries, and even some companies and countries in Europe. But I think the big issue is, does Trump overplay his hand, and do the U.S. and China overplay their hands? I think there is a counter coming back from China on Trump tariffs that will hurt the global system and could create some growth slowdowns, particularly in the first part of next year. I think the legacy manufacturers have been damaged by the industrial policies that have been put in place, mainly Germany and China getting hurt by the Inflation Reduction Act and other trade restrictions that are going on. I think the debt problem that we talked about earlier creates real issues for a lot of governments, particularly in the emerging economies and in Europe, where demands on the governments are far greater than the spending available to them. And in Europe, they have to really look at their fiscal restraints that are put on by the European mandates. And Germany and France really have to lead the way in opening up the spend to maybe do some more deficit spending there. I think domestic and global conflicts are going to continue to be a problem. And I would caution that while there are lower valuations to be found around the world, I think some of them are value traps. So I would be careful about where you go. And in terms of industries, the ones I would play in the private or public markets are the ones we talk about here on a regular basis. The shift to AI, I think AI becoming a reality will require more software and development where it becomes more mainstream. And I think that's where you'll see the big plays there. I continue to think there'll be money made and lost in AI that'll be similar to what we saw in the tech bubble back in the 2000s, but not everyone's going to win in this. I think energy, industrials, and financials will continue to be big winners as well. And I think selectively healthcare, in spite of the push to lower cost, I think the breakthroughs in healthcare will create some tremendous opportunities for investors as well. So Mark, I'm going to stop there and open up for discussion.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Questions, comments? Pregnant pause.
Awesome. We can wrap up.
Just a little
You're not getting
insight.
off that easy.
The Illinois was example I know was just one page.
Yep.
Illinois is the extreme. I met with them probably about 13 years ago. They were in a similar position, which is amazing considering how much the market's gone up and everything's gone up in all that time. So, but underfunded pensions is a chronic problem in the United States. But Illinois is really an extreme example. It was back then, and it is today.
It speaks, though, to the demands that states have and getting pulled in a lot of different ways right now, and worries about, you've seen big migration from certain states, New York, California being among the leaders, and the bills come and due for bad policy decisions. And I think Illinois is an extreme example of that, but there are others New Jersey, California, and other bills are going to come due in similar fashion because we have not made the investments we need to make, keeping up on our funding obligations.
That's the only question about Illinois.
It's a lot to digest. Stephen, as usual, great job, but you covered like a huge waterfront there. So I guess the continuing question on China is their 5-year plan was to move to a more consumer-oriented country and not be export-led. Clearly, COVID and the current financial difficulties are hampering that. I think they're trying to do what they can. The easing and perhaps the next credit impulse will probably help. But any further thoughts on that?
It's a tough one. I think the New York meeting had some really good discussions on it, where you had two different views. I think one view was without a leadership change, it's too hard to invest in. And the other view is there's plenty of opportunities in that country like there are in every other country. You just have to find them. I think that until they get the consumer going, I think they're going to have real issues because they're oversupplying areas that are hurting the rest of the world, particularly their two big markets, which is North America and Europe. And if you keep exporting your overcapacity into other regions, they won't stand for it for long. And then how does China move forward? Can they rely on the global South to carry them forward? I'm not sure. And until they get their own consumers moving, I think that's a big issue. So I think you're touched on the big one, Bill, is they need a better balanced economy and their policies aren't getting them there quickly enough. So I think they're going to struggle. I think capital outflows continue to be an issue. And until they can find a way to get a better relation, a more practical relationship between the U.S. and between the West and China, I think it's going to be very hard when their two biggest markets are in a state of flux about how they're going to work together. They are making calls for it, but they don't seem to be big enough.
Jonathan?
I think only you tried 72 different doors.
Someone's speaking. So, hold on. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Thank you. Stephen, could you comment a little bit on the demographics in China, specifically that the one-child policy is now moving up into the workforce?
Yeah, that's a problem. Also, the social safety net for the elderly is a problem. They got a slew of problems, but demographics are a problem in Europe. They're a problem in Japan. They're a problem in Korea. And they're a problem here. If we didn't have our immigration going, the fertility rate around the world's too low. So that's going to be that's an issue for them. It's an issue for rebalancing their economy the right way too. And you also have 11 million college graduates a year, and youth unemployment is quite high. So I think the problems are real there, but I could make the case the problems are real in every one of those places we just touched on, including the U.S.
Well,
I think it's really
some of those things, Stephen, we didn't see in China, but now we're seeing like this mass stabbings. Like that's like when have you ever heard of that happening in the last 3 or 4 decades?
Yeah, I think the social unrest issue is the one that keeps the leaders there up at night. And when you see the changes going on in other countries, in developed countries, getting leaders thrown out, at some point populations say it's not working for us. So I do think that's a growing issue. And if what China really needs is helicopter money or a way to incent the consumers not to save as much. And it's hard to have that confidence given their property values have been distorted and their equity markets have been sporty, to say the least, for investors. So I think it's hard for them to have the confidence as consumers, so they're saving money and they need them to be spending it. So I think they need to do some helicopter money type policies to get the economy moving better. And I don't know that their debt problems will allow them to do that.
Fair enough. Jeff, so are you there still? May not be. He'd asked me a question. I'll just share it. He asked me how many, I showed you this list of events, but oh, I passed it already. Maybe I passed it. There's one thing I was going to show him, which was this. How many people we expect at the different events? Across Naples and Miami, I think we're at 150 plus. We can accommodate 125 plus or minus some more in Miami, and about 100 to 110 in Naples, but I think across the two events. We'll have 200 plus April 28th and 9th in Riyadh, then smaller numbers in Abu Dhabi, Dubai. Actually, next up is February, New York. And that'll be more like 75, 90. Palo Alto, we're adding Seattle. It's June 16th, 17th, 18th. Speaking of, there's this new kind of helicopter. Oh, I can't, it's called Whisk. That can take, or maybe it's a plane that can take from San Francisco up to Seattle. So we might have access to some of that. And then we're in Newport again, summertime, everyone's happy. The leaves are changing in London and New York, and then we're in Singapore. So just a sense of numbers at the moment. I don't know. He was the one who asked, and then he left. But yeah, that's the calendar. You can see it on the events page. Other questions, comments?
Mark, I just wrap up with watch the press conference for Powell tomorrow and watch the market reaction. And I would not be surprised if we have into the first part of the new year some sell-offs in the US equity markets and maybe in other markets around the world. In the US, I suspect, given the run we've had the last couple of years, that there will be significant tax selling that was delayed until the first week of the year. And between that and other concerns that people have on the upcoming administration's policies, we are due for a reasonable pullback that would give people an opportunity to buy. But don't be surprised if you see a lot of selling early in the year for tax purposes. That was delayed this year because if they thought the Democrats were going to win, they would have sold this year and taken the gains at this tax rate. But now they could push it off to January 1st or 2nd and take it then. And I suspect you'll see some early year volatility in the markets that can give you an opportunity to buy in if you think you've missed stuff. Be patient right now.
Gotcha. Andy?
Just an opinion,
By the
Stephen.
way, Andy, are you able to come? You're going to come to Florida again?
I am at a wedding in Mexico on the 25th, so I am going to try and fly back through Miami on my way. That is the plan at the moment. My
Everybody
friends
knows
are making
Andy injured himself playing pickleball a couple years ago. So
Yeah.
I want the return of Andy.
So if my friends screw all this up, I'll be in Naples. Anyway, so, Stephen, I know that you're not going to be a fan of this comment, but I think the Fed got it really wrong. Short rates are way too high. Long rates are normalized already. 10-year, 7-year mortgage are all normalized. And if they cut rates into the 375, which was the low bar on your chart, the good things would happen. The debt service would come down. They could finance the debt cheaper. Credit card rates would come down. They've gone up absurdly, the credit card interest rates. So that's inflationary. In fact, I don't think it would stimulate inflation all that much. So I think the Fed's really got it wrong, being too tight for too long.
What it would stimulate is an asset bubble potentially if they go too far too fast.
No, because the short rates only drive overnight bank lending rates and a few other things. What would drive a bubble is if, for instance, the 10-year went back to 1.35% or some dumb thing like that, or mortgages went to 2% or something like that. That's what would drive a bubble. I don't think the Fed cutting rates to 375 is going to drive a bubble, or is it going? It's not going to move 7-year, 10-year, or 30-year rates. That's my opinion.
Respect the opinion. I think the Fed was too aggressive in September. I think the economy is too strong for what they need to do. I agree with you. Short rates are too high, and actually the credit card rates are loan shark like. So the government could deal with that with a policy change. They could cap the rates if they wanted to. They're just ridiculously high.
No, they're ridiculous, but they went up 10% when.
Oh, without question. I think it's crazy. But I think we have to be careful about the economy getting too hot, which people aren't expecting. But we have a very strong U.S. economy right now. If you pour oil on it, you could really light the fire.
Agreed. I just don't think the overnight. I think the Fed funds rate is not the driver of that. I think the 10-year would be the biggest impact if it were to come down a lot. But I agree with that.
I think the other thing that's not getting enough attention, Mark, is the currency. And one of the cases for lowering our rates would be that our currency, if we don't, and everyone else is cutting, is going to be too strong, and that will create big distortions in the rest of the global system that goes against actually part of what Trump's trying to do, which is he'd prefer a weaker dollar and more exports, which is not one of the strongest policies we have. But I think that's something to keep an eye on, because that's where you can see the next problem triggered is in the currency markets.
Well, but the other issue is trade wars and tariffs are not good for exports.
Yes. That's the contradiction I was talking about earlier.
Michael, they're inflationary. Tariffs are inflationary.
Oh, granted, but I mean, if you want to export, you don't pick fights with the people who are potential customers.
And the imports that are tariffed, they're simply passed along to consumers.
Exactly.
Well, they're initially eaten by the companies that can and pushed on partially to the consumer. And then in some cases, it's pushed on fully. But they try and not do it right away if they can eat it.
Yeah, but the historical math is really pretty clear.
Well, particularly since most companies aren't in a fiscal spot to eat it right now.
You got a few opinions here today, Andy. That's good. Any other questions, comments?
Okay, I'll bite. So, Stephen, when you touched on India, how does it play out as far as India has a lot of folks coming to the US on H-1B visas, etc. Trump's policy is to tighten down on both illegal and legal visits to the States, if you will. What sort of impact on India, companies like Wipro, whatever, do you see?
I think Trump, on one hand, definitely wants to close the borders and says he wants to deport all the illegals, but I don't think he actually means that. I do think that, and I don't think it's feasible. I think that countries like India are not the area that is not the countries that he would target. I think he does target countries, although he can't necessarily do that with immigration policy directly. But I think when you have Ramaswamy and Musk knowing that they need the technical guys to come in, I think they'll work on the H-1B visa part while they're doing the other part. And I think we need to fix that part of the immigration to get legal immigration squared away at the same time you're doing the illegal immigration issues that you're dealing with. And I think that's where if they can thread that needle, that's the win. Because I think you're touching on something, Michael. We absolutely need the right immigrants coming here. Our fertility rates are way down here too. So the challenges of Europe, Japan, and China in terms of demographics, we have not as bad, but we have a headwind coming in that area that we're going to have to watch out for. So I think they're going to have a tough time getting the immigration policy right. We haven't gotten it right here for a long time. So I think they'll make some mistakes early and then figure out how to get it right a little bit later, unfortunately.
Stephen, back to China tariffs. Do you have any opinion that Musk having some say in all of this, at least for the moment? He's very dependent on China, very integrated in China. Tesla is big in China. Pissing off the Chinese is not on Musk's list of things to do. Do you think he'll have any impact on that sort of approach?
I think it's interesting. I think two of the corporate leaders that have been reported to have very good relationships with Trump are Musk and Tim Cook, who are the two companies that most need China. So
yes.
I think we have to keep that in the back of our minds as to how they play it. I think the other thing is we have to wait and see what China's playbook is for Trump 2.0 as well. They've had 4 years to come up with how they would deal with him coming back. And I think they were surprised. They didn't have a playbook for Trump the first time around. I think they've figured out a playbook for him this time, and we have to see what they're going to counter the tariffs with. So I think it's going to be really tricky to see. I think everything depends on how US and China play out, and then the rest of the world can figure out how they fit in that ecosystem. I don't mean to be as callous as that or make it like they're the only two that matter, but I think they will matter more than most in this. And I think how the US and China decide to move forward will have big implications for the global system. And we just have to kind of wait and see how President Trump and President Xi play it out. It's interesting, the comment on Lighthizer not getting into the administration was he might not have been hawkish enough on China, which, if that's the case, that could be a scare. Or it could be a tactic for Trump to get him to the table differently. I don't know.
You could argue Biden's already been somewhat hawkish on China and continued what Trump started.
Yep. He hasn't pulled back much at all.
Nope.
If anything,
Not
I think it's continued it. So, but China hasn't really fought back yet. I think they're waiting for see how things go.
But at this point in the game, does it really matter what Biden has done?
No, it's just
a trend.
It's just a continuation. Exactly. He didn't undo what Trump started. So the message has been consistent. It's one of the few areas that Washington does have some relatively some degree of agreement from the two parties is China's a problem. I don't think they agree on what the problem is, but they just know China's a problem.
No, but the policies have been continuous and extended, if nothing else. So, yeah.
Yep.
Any other insights, questions?
Staying on tariffs, Stephen, Europe, they just threw a 48% tariff on Chinese electric cars. Europe does not look, they're not as noisy about it, but the tariff situation coming out of Europe isn't exactly friendly either. What do you think?
I think it's going to get worse for them in China. I think Europe is now has to move into a desperation mode to save some of their legacy industries that are driving them forward or have driven them forward in the past and are now hurting them. So I think the China oversupply is going to be one of the dominant themes for next year, and in terms of both policy and markets. I think the areas that they're oversupplying, people are going to have to figure out how they want to play them or not play them, and what are the counters coming from everyone. So while the US is waiting on China's counter to Trump's tariffs, the Europeans are starting their counter to China's trade practices as well. And I think that's what I was saying. I think you're going to see a continuation of the trade barriers going up around the world, and that is not good for inflation.
And an outlier question, any chance of a UK-US trade deal a la NAFTA?
Yeah, I think the UK has, has to figure. They're all sitting there. Was it a good decision to Brexit or not?
Too
And
late now.
it's too late now. But what's left, and how do they play that? And they were trying to do more stuff with Europe, and Europe was like, that's not the rules now. So I think the UK is another. I didn't touch on them. I think their problems are similar to the rest of Europe's problems. Actually, leadership and bad policies that are now coming home to roost. How do they get out of it? They got a tough one there. There are a lot of old industries that Europe and the UK have been relying on that are getting undercut by global competition, and what's behind it to fill it in. I think they have some really great companies in Europe, but not enough of them and not enough scale for them. And unless Europe decides they want to get behind a couple regional champions, I'm not sure how you compete with the global champions of Europe and of the US and China in a lot of those areas. So they have to figure out where they're going to play and where they can win, or just regulate their way through it, which I don't think they grow enough to get out of their problems through regulation. It's a tough time to be it's a tough time to be an incumbent. It's also a tough time coming in and replacing the incumbents, because the problems that the incumbents created or that existed that got them fired are all still there, and the money to solve them isn't. Particularly in Europe, where they have such tight fiscal policy restrictions on deficits. So until they loosen that band up, they're going to have a hard time getting out of their problems.
So
FYI,
Stephen-
they have the same rules on pensions. Your fully funded pensions mostly across Europe.
So Stephen, how's your crystal ball?
Terrible.
I was going to ask what your thoughts are on Europe's IRIS satellite constellation effort.
Way above my pay grade, Michael. I can't follow all the programs that the smart guys here do that. So I'd have to ask one of them.
Well, Michael, if you take the GPS model, when we did it, nobody said, well, we're not all going to rely on the US, and we're not all going to rely on Elon Musk. And the way we can put satellites up so easily, it's hard to believe there won't be a whole bunch of global satellite networks all competing with each other.